Join me as I skip through the 6-hour process of creating Grabenwald from start to finish, showing you all the major choices and Goxel features that I used. Going in, I knew I wanted to make a map with trenches, and having just watched a video from Epic History about the Battle of Verdun, I saw font Doodad as an inspiration for adding a central bunker of some description. Despite wanting trenches, I knew that I didn't want flat terrain, so I began with effects generate Genland. The main parameters to make it flatter were to remove the river, lower the base height and amplitude, and reduce the terrain noise. Using the layer wrap tool, I then positioned the slightly higher part of the map across the centre. I then went to a high Z origin at base brush, switched to plane snapping, and positioned it roughly around where I wanted the bottom of the trench to be, and went to work carving out the trench shape and the space for the bunker. I later figured out that I should have been more careful about the brush width and depth of the trench. I should have been moving the plane up and down to roughly match the contours of the terrain itself, as I only really wanted the trenches themselves to appear 4 or 5 blocks deep. Much time was spent using the smooth tool on the edges and fixing up various widths and depths. I then ran the effect generate terrain colouring filter, changing some parameters, and found this slightly dirty looking combination. Now approaching 2 hours in, I started on the fort, roughly using Fort Doodad as inspiration, but ended up kind of freestyling most of it. I think you could say that I borrowed the shape with the dry moat, the type of bunkers on top, and a couple of the galleries, and the fact I gave it underground tunnels. To make the bunkers, I made a shape on top of the train and used the fuzzy select hollow functionality to hollow them out. I then realised I probably should just make one and then clone it, so I extended one of them downwards with the expectation of adding a spiral staircase, and then cloned it 3 times, using the move tool to shift it into position and rotate those clones. I used the clones so that any edit I made to the source single bunker would propagate to the others. I then connected the bunkers to each other using a central underground passage. With that done, I kinda wanted to work on something else, so I looked at the map as a whole and decided to add trees. I used the Doodad placement filter trick to avoid certain areas, which was to take a copy of the terrain layer, kind of annihilate any areas where I didn't want trees, and then get the Doodad placement filter to only use this specific layer for heights and placeable areas, while placing models in our new layer. To mudden the floors of the trenches, I used a dithered and anti-aliased brush, using the surface paint option so that I didn't have to worry about the verticality, as the surface paint option will simply paint any block exposed to air in the painting area. Here I took a bit of a break to design and build an entirely new filter for Goxel under Plan Explosions. The central idea is that you make a plan layer with blocks representing the positions of explosions, and then like the other plan filters, you choose a layer to apply the plan onto. Unlike the other plan-related filters, I couldn't really see any way to make this one non-destructive, so here's some advice on working with this new destructive workflow. Let's say I have my terrain layer here, and I've dotted about these explosion locations. Before triggering the explosions, I'm going to take a backup of the terrain by duplicating it. Later on, I might decide that, actually, I don't want these middle explosions, and instead want these beautiful looking structures to be placed on a new small hill where I currently have the craters. Because I have the undamaged backup available, I can just restore that backup, delete the damaged one, make the terrain changes, and take a fresh backup before detonating again. This process of taking a backup before you make destructive changes neatly works around the destructive nature of the filter. The longer you can avoid making non-reversible changes to large layers like terrain, the more flexible you can be and the more time you can potentially save. Back to the map, I added some trench objects like braces, holding shift while in the brush tool to draw lines across. I then went back to the centre and added the gallery position at the 2 main entrances of the fort, connecting them up to the tunnel network and the entrances themselves. Approaching the 4-hour mark now, I wanted to add platforms in the trenches, for players to more easily look over the top. Most of this was just using a 1-block brush, but one simple but useful note here is that where my wooden platform met the terrain, and I wanted the platform to be that entire surface, I could just focus the layer using the button or tab, extend the platform towards the terrain freely, and then unfocus that layer. Because the object layer is higher in the layer list than the terrain, it then overwrites the terrain blocks in the same positions. After that, I switched to the placer and loaded in some KVX models I had around. Influx's AA gun and searchlights that were used in the Iglesias map, which I placed on top of the fort. At this point, I had already been posting screenshots in the Voxel Cartography Discord, the link to which will be in the description. And Tank came along with a add some tall trees and it's Hurtgen forest, which got me pining for a particular type of tree. To make it, I opened a new editor and set up the image size so that the distance from the center of the box to the outside of the image box was about the maximum length I wanted my branches to be, and then set about to create the trees from scratch, using the line brush from the trunk in the center to the outer walls of the image box and adjusting from there. But even with randomly flip and randomly rotate enabled in the placer, one tree wasn't going to be enough variety. I ended up creating a bunch of different models. The two tall trees, squished down versions of those trees, a couple of trunks, a couple of part trunk, part felled trees, a fully felled tree, and two bushes. The first two were made from scratch using the process I had previously just described. To make the squished versions, I just took each of the two big trees, opened the Move Tools scaling by custom axis, and chose about 70% for the Z axis, and then manually corrected any floating blocks that resulted. The two trunks were made on a new layer in the map project itself, using the Export As option to save them for later. Trunk 2's endpoint was actually lower than its starting point, so when using the placer I had to use a Z offset of -1 so that the trunk bit started at the cursor. The part trunk, part felled trees were made in a new file by cutting the top off a squished tree, rotating that top in the placer so that it was on its side, and then fixing up any odd looking pieces. I made a straight line version and an angled version this way, because if I just made the straight one and asked the placer to rotate it by 45 degrees randomly, it would likely result in some floating blocks sometimes. So I decided to make a specific 45-degree version up front so I could just rotate by 90 degrees for both of them. I used these and the trunks mostly in the more heavily bombarded areas to try and emphasize the destruction. The bushes were then made in the map project itself and sprinkled about and exported too. Given we were near the end and I wasn't making any more terrain changes, it was at this point I decided to then hollow out the central bunker. This was manually done. Perhaps there's a feature I can add to help with this, or maybe I could have closed the ends of the bunker and used fuzzy select with a color threshold to try and select the inner blocks, but did it by hand in the end. And that marked the end of the 6 hours. I think I may still add more map details to it, like barbed wire, maybe a trench bunker or two, and other things. But I think this is where I'll end the case study. I hope this was useful. Links to download Goxel and join the Voxel Cartography Discord are in the description below. See you next time.